Good afternoon, everyone. Happy fall. We truly have a special program for you all today, and I must confess, I've been really looking forward to this all summer. We are thrilled to host a preview of the groundbreaking exhibition of Manet and Morisot, which will be held at the Legion of Honor Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, opening on October 11th. This is the first time a major museum show has been devoted to a pairing of these two extraordinary artists. And we have the privilege today of being led through a virtual tour of sorts by the museum's chief curator, Emily Beeny. Emily is the chief curator of the Legion of Honor and a Barbara Wolfe curator in charge of European paintings at the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco. A specialist in French paintings and drawings of the 17th through 19th century, she received her PhD from Columbia University with a dissertation on Nicolas Poussin. Before coming to San Francisco, she served as Associate Curator of Drawings at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, where her exhibition projects included Manet and Modern Beauty, La Surprise, Watteau in Los Angeles, and Poussin and the Dance. She has also held curatorial appointments at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Norton Simon Museum, and currently serves on the board of the vetting committee for TEFAF Maastricht and the editorial board of the Boletín del Museo del Prado. Please welcome Emily. Now, before I turn the stage over to Emily and her fascinating talk on this exhibition, I just want to tell everyone that we will have time at the end of Emily's presentation for an audience Q&A. The presentation may run a bit over time, so please do stay with us for the Q&A if you do have questions. And now it is my pleasure to turn the stage over to Emily Beeny. Emily, welcome.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction and for the invitation to speak today. I'm so grateful to everybody who's joined us. And I do thank you for your patience with maybe a slightly long presentation. This is really the first talk I'm giving on this material, so I'm eager to hear your questions at the end. Manet and Morisot opening here in San Francisco in October will be, as Elizabeth told us, the first exhibition dedicated to the friendship and artistic exchange between Édouard Manet and Berthe Morisot. I think this may come as a surprise, since unfolding over roughly 15 years, from the late 1860s to the early 1880s, theirs really was the closest relationship between any two members of the Impressionist circle. As friends and colleagues, painter and model, collectors of each other's work, and following Morisot's marriage to Manet's brother, family. It had a determining effect on the course of art history, for its story is written in their pictures. Seen side by side, the paintings we'll discuss today trace the evolution of a singular friendship, by turns collaborative and competitive, playful and charged, lit by an enduring sympathy and a shared desire to make art new. As people and as painters, Manet and Morisot were, of course, quite different. Where he was all charm and wit, open to the world in ways then possible only for a man of his social class and temperament, she was admired for her formidable reserve, her discreet elegance and intelligence, the corresponding virtues of a correct bourgeoise. The pleasures of Manet's art, of course, lie in its indelible graphic power, its dialogue with the old masters, its joyous, outsize ambition. The pleasures of Morisot's work are subtler ones, I think, of light and surface, of images like breath on glass that shimmer with the possibility of their own disappearance. Manet was a studio painter in origin and essence, and generally produced pictures he hoped would look dashed off at the first go, only through protracted revisions that he carefully concealed. Morisot, by contrast, was formed almost from the beginning as a plein air landscape painter, and could work swiftly and decisively under changing conditions of light and weather. Though cast by contemporary press as the father of Impressionism, Manet never joined the Impressionist group, preferring the public salon as his arena of combat. Conversely, Morisot was among the movement's earliest and most faithful adherents, recognizing in the group's independent exhibitions an opportunity to share experimental work and showing her own in all but one of them. From the beginning, critics mistook Morisot for Manet's pupil, whether intending to flatter or to denigrate, and alas, many 20th century art historians followed suit. Reducing this complex relationship to the beguiling portraits that Manet painted of Morisot, and overlooking, or indeed disparaging, her own work to cast her as his model and muse. But as several of the artist's first biographers already understood, and as feminist scholarship of more recent decades has confirmed, while Morisot looked to Manet for inspiration and approval during her early career, in the 1870s and early 1880s, as Morisot's work became more daring and garnered widespread acclaim, Manet began to follow her example, emulating her choice of subjects, her high-key colors, and most especially her rapid, fluttering brushstrokes. The result is an extraordinary convergence witnessed in pictures like these. The two artists surely crossed paths at the Louvre in the mid-1860s. Like others of their generation, both visited regularly to make copies after the old masters. He was already famous, or infamous, for bold modern life paintings that shocked the Parisian art establishment. Her submissions to the annual state-sponsored salon, meanwhile, chiefly landscapes, attracted little notice. He was in his 30s and married. She was in her 20s and not. He came to the Louvre on his own, while she was accompanied by her mother, a watchful chaperone, and her sister, Édouard, an equally accomplished painter, whose portrait of Morisot before her easel we see here. The connection was made by Henri Fontaine-Latour, a fellow artist and mutual friend, who here portrayed Manet as the leader of a new realist generation. Writing to Fontaine in the summer of 1868, Manet would remark, "I'm of the same opinion. The young Morisot ladies are charming. It's a bother they're not men, but as women they could still serve the cause of painting by marrying an academician each and sowing discord in the dotards' camp." Here Morisot makes her first appearance in Manet's correspondence, as someone whose sensibility should have made her a brother-in-arms in the fight for progressive art, but whose gender instead qualified her as a marriage prospect for someone else. By the fall of 1868, Morisot was visiting Manet's studio regularly, chaperoned by her mother, to pose for the balcony. Transforming a green railing and shutters into a bright proscenium, Manet's composition proposes a theater of enigmatic sociability. As most always in his exhibition works, one protagonist attracts our gaze with her own, at once magnetic and inscrutable. Here is Morisot, costumed in a dressing gown, her dark curls loose, playing a woman evidently at home. She rests her elbow on the railing, clasping her femme shut and casting her eyes off to the left, oblivious of her companions, modeled by the landscape painter Antoine Guillemet and the violinist Fanny Close. When the picture was unveiled at the Salon in May 1869, critics fretted over its narrative incoherence. What story exactly is told? They compared the figures to wax dolls in a dime store window, and Manet's handling to that of a house painter. He nevertheless retained a naive hope of finding a buyer, claiming that Berthe brought him luck. What she actually brought was keen understanding, offering an incisive assessment of the picture in a letter to her sister. His paintings, as always, create the impression of a wild or even still slightly green fruit. I'm far from disliking them. I am more strange than ugly. Apparently the epithet femme fatale has been circulating among connoisseurs. By the time the exhibition opened, Morisot had reached a crisis in her own practice. Having exhibited regularly at the Salon over the previous 5 years, mostly Barbizon-inflected landscapes like the one pictured here, she showed nothing of her own in 1869. In March, Édouard, her beloved sister and artistic collaborator, had married a naval officer, joining him at Lorient in Brittany and giving up painting altogether. Writing to Édouard, Morisot laid out plans for a visit that summer. "I'm absolutely counting on my stay at Lorient to make something passable. I've made absolutely nothing since you left, and begin to despair about it." The visit would prove extraordinarily fruitful, providing Morisot with an opportunity to renew her practice with a fresh emphasis on the figure, informed by her time in Manet's studio. Morisot painted 2 pivotal canvases at Lorient with Edma as her model, a harbor view showing her sister perched on a canal wall under a hot summer sky, and an interior scene given over almost entirely to her sister's likeness. This latter work presents striking similarities with the one for which Morisot herself had finished posing just a few months before. Both Manet's balcony and Morisot's young woman at her window feature seated women in white, holding fans and framed by balcony windows. The two artists' methods of positioning these women and their beholders, though, could scarcely be more different. Where Manet's picture grants us a glimpse of a private interior observed from the public street, Morisot's offers a slice of the street, glimpsed from within an interior. While Manet gives us a view of the balcony, Morisot grants us a view from the balcony. Lost in thought, Morisot's young woman fingers the pleats of her fan, paying no attention to the window before her, which gives onto a balcony and tree-lined avenue. Note the bottle green awnings reminiscent of Manet's balcony window. Brief strokes of paint, some delicate and faint as pencil marks, some in unexpected shades of red and blue, pick out the tendrils of the young woman's hair, the features of her face. Morisot made no attempt, however, to reveal the contents of this young woman's mind, conjuring instead the privacy of thought itself. Back in Paris, both pictures received an enthusiastic response from Manet, to whom Morisot presented Harbor at Lorient as a gift, the first picture by one of these two painters to enter the other's collection. On Manet's advice, she submitted the other canvas to the Salon of 1870, where its companion piece would be a work with a more troubled early history. A double portrait of her sister and mother, the only canvas we know both artists touched. Receiving mixed feedback on the likeness of her mother, from her close friend and sometimes suitor, Puvis de Chavannes, Morisot sought Manet's guidance. He promised to stop by and advise, but on arriving instead picked up her brushes and began repainting the figure. Evidently concentrating on the skirt and the face, where broad application, particularly of white, black, and gray paint, assorts oddly with the more patient and refined approach typical of Morisot's facture at this stage. She was furious, hurt and confused at his reckless act of self-assertion, and mortified when forced to surrender the retouched picture for delivery to the Salon jury, confiding to her mother that she'd rather throw herself in the Seine than see it hang in the exhibition. But hang it would. Both of Morisot's submissions were accepted, attracting little critical attention. "I don't make as grotesque an impression as I feared," she remarked, her fury cooled. It is nevertheless telling that instead of fawning gratitude, her immediate response to Manet's meddling was one of furious, frustrated independence. The same salon witnessed the debut of another female artist associated with Manet and the Impressionist circle, Eva Gonzalez, a pupil of Charles Le Chaplin who had studied with Manet for just over a year and sat for this portrait, likewise exhibited in 1870, over the course of many months. Dressing her in a white robe en galle and casting her as a successor to the great women artists of the 18th century, Manet compelled Gonzalez to pose at least 40 times, scrubbing out her face so often the canvas threatened to give way. Morisot, surely missing her own sessions in Manet's studio, each a precious opportunity for observation and exchange, vented her irritation with both her friend and his pupil in letters to Édouard. Though she at first described the portrait as the best thing he's ever done, on seeing it unveiled at the Salon, she offered a cooler assessment. It's passable, and nothing more. Her own sittings soon resumed as she posed, probably over the summer of 1870, for her only other salon-scale likeness by Manet. With its dark-haired model and billowing white dress, the picture might seem a kind of sequel to the Gonzalez portrait, but the strange, even scandalous lassitude of Morisot's pose and the implicit fiction, made explicit by the painting's eventual title, Repose, of capturing a model resting between formal posing sessions, place this painting in a separate category. This picture, as Manet reassured the subject's mother some years later, is not at all in the character of a portrait. By the time he wrote these lines, the canvas was squirreled away in a friend's cellar, for a dark chapter was unfolding in Paris. And by the time Repose finally went on view at the Salon in 1873, both artists' worlds had been remade. The comparison has become a classic, a cliché even. Two views captured on canvases of broad marine format show the same slice of Paris from high ground on the right bank. These pictures are nevertheless utterly distinct in purpose and effect, reflecting their authors' utterly distinct relationships to the urban landscape and its meaning. One is a studio concoction, the other a plein air study. One is a portrait of second imperial spectacle, the other the souvenir of a strange, unsettled time that followed. Both reflect their author's deep and kindred sense of themselves as Parisiens de Paris. Painted during the Exposition Universelle of 1867, Manet's scene deploys the fairground fantasy of the Champ de Mars as a backdrop for the theater of modern life. Top-hatted flaneurs take in the view, and imperial soldiers chat. An elegant rider perches on her prancing steed. A little groom walks a big dog, and so on. Surely slotted in from individual pencil sketches of the kind Manet often made on the street, these figures represent various urban types, stock characters of the modern city. The urban landscape itself is dramatically upstaged, suggested in a fragmentary jumble of monuments, just recognizable bridges, towers, and domes. Painted about 5 years later, Morisot's picture provides a quite different experience. The parade ground of the Champ de Mars, emptied of the World's Fair, stretches out at right, a vast, vacant lot beneath a low cloud cover. Urban geography is precisely rendered. Successive bridges march into the distance along the Seine. The gleaming dome of the Invalides at right stands closer to our vantage than the towers of Sainte-Clotilde and Notre-Dame and the distant dome of the Panthéon, rendered in pale atmospheric perspective. Drinking it all in the right foreground stands a little girl, her back turned, inviting us to share in her sensations of light and air. For this whole scene, unlike Manet's, is observed from life, with Morisot setting up her easel on the edge of the Place du Trocadéro at the end of her own street to sketch. Morisot had surely seen Manet's picture in his studio when sitting for repose, but painted her own view under very different circumstances and at a very different moment in history, after the ravages of 1870 to 1871, the année terrible of the Franco-Prussian War, siege of Paris, and Commune. As Prussian troops closed in on the French capital in the fall of 1870, Manet and his brothers joined the National Guard, fighting alongside Degas, Renoir, Basile, and more academically minded colleagues like Ernest Meissonier. Manet's mother, wife, and godson were sent away to safety in the south, fleeing with thousands of other civilians, but Morisot and her parents remained behind, enduring the terror and privations of the dark months that followed, near starvation, contagious disease, bitter cold, and relentless shelling. The letters Manet addressed to his wife during this time paint a vivid picture of the city under siege, and offer a glimpse into the life of the Morisot ladies, whom Manet and his brothers visited when they could, reporting on their struggle to bear the hardships, increasingly depressed and ill. Manet naturally painted little during this time. This view of Petit Montrouge near the city ramparts is a notable exception. But he had stashed 12 of his most valuable canvases, repose included, for safekeeping with his friend Théodore Duret, a critic and collector, and could rest assured that these would emerge from the conflict unscathed. Morisot, sick and almost starving, produced no work at all, and much worse, may have lost most everything she made to date. Though her father placed the family's fine furniture in storage, he offered only a pitying smile, in her words, when she suggested that her studio contents too might merit protective measures. Sure enough, upon returning home after the final round of Prussian shelling, her mother found most everything destroyed. "The paintings," she wrote, "you may as well get to work." Morisot had no collector friend to keep her pictures safe, and at a stroke 14 years' production likely all but vanished. In early February, following the surrender of Paris, both artists left the city. Manet to rejoin his family in the south, Morisot to stay with her sisters at Cherbourg. Packing her bags, Morisot wrote to Édouard, "I've emerged from the siege utterly disgusted with my fellow men, even my greatest friends," adding dryly, "Manet spent the whole siege changing his uniform." The crippling financial terms of the French surrender and the new regime's abrupt end to a moratorium on rents touched off an uprising known as the Paris Commune, which took control of the capital in March and was suppressed 2 months later with shocking violence. In a brief period known as the Semaine Sanglante, government troops slaughtered some 20,000 Parisians or more, a massacre Manet memorialized in this watercolor. It is with these traumatic events in mind that we must consider Morisot's apparently placid view of Paris, this eerily empty city, with new saplings planted along the river and new dresses donned for a stroll. In June 1871, Manet had addressed one of his most substantial surviving letters to Morisot at Cherbourg, remarking, "What terrible events, and how shall we come out of it all?" Then adopting a brighter note, "I think, mademoiselle, you are not going to stay in Cherbourg long. Everyone is coming back to Paris. In any case, it is impossible to live anywhere else." Affinities between works by Manet and Morisot are, of course, not always a matter of direct and immediate influence, of a specific picture painted by one artist and seen by the other. Compositional similarities that emerge in the early 1870s also speak to increasingly shared habits of seeing, informed by looking at each other's work and the work of friends, but also by shared experiences as members of a Parisian milieu staggering out of the terrible year. Two interior scenes dated to the year or two following the siege offer a case in point. Each features a seated figure in profile at right, who appears beside another in lost profile, looking out a window at left. The picture's protagonists do not interact. A mood of quiet reverie, perhaps even of melancholy, pervades them, and an open window framing an outside world unseen or imperfectly glimpsed plays a prominent role in each. As ever, the pictures are quite different, one a modest work, evidently abandoned incomplete, the other a large, exquisitely finished exhibition picture. Yet they share preoccupations, with natural light and interior space, with intimacy and loneliness. Manet's interior at Arcachon was among the first canvases he painted after the war, marking his reunion with his family in a coastal town near Bordeaux. As the document of this long-anticipated meeting, though, the painting is oddly muted. Manet's godson, Léon, smokes a cigarette and stares into space, a neglected book spread on his knee. The painter's wife, Suzanne, props one leg on a stool, pen and paper in her lap, gaze fixed on the sea. Suzanne's letters to Manet during their 6 months apart do not survive, but his to her are filled with expressions of love and longing to see her sweet face. How strange, then, here to turn that face away, rendering her body as a series of round volumes. Evidently unsatisfied with the work, Manet scraped down large sections before abandoning the effort altogether. The resulting effect is peculiarly unresolved, capturing the uneasy mood in a family reunited after very different wartime experiences. Manet's stay in the South had some bearing on Morisot, too, for he and his brother Eugène had evidently tried to persuade her to accompany Eugène on the journey to Bordeaux in what Manet later characterized as a marriage scheme. Morisot had demurred, nursing a new dream of financial independence, as she wrote to Edma that spring. "I don't know if I'm fooling myself, but it seems to me that a painting like the one I gave to Manet, here at right, could perhaps be saleable, and that is my whole ambition." Her mother, however, counseled marriage. "Everyone agrees that it's better to marry, making some sacrifices, than to remain independent in a position that isn't real. One must think that in a few years she will be lonelier, with fewer connections, and that as her charms abandon her, she will have many fewer friends than she believes she does now." Such anxieties were by no means unreasonable. They offer a useful backdrop against which to consider Morisot's interior. The scene unfolds in an elegant apartment, paneled in white and gold. A young woman in black, not to be mistaken for morning dress, given the glimmer of jewelry at her throat and wrist, sits with her hands in her lap, composed, unreadable. She wears no wedding band. An empty chair suggests she may be awaiting a visitor. Perhaps the person whose arrival at a street door the little girl seems to observe through the window at left. The intricate still life at right is at first difficult to parse. A gilt-framed mirror hangs on the wall. Before the mirror stands a large round planter, its gilded lip barely containing an overflow of greenery. Against the planter rests what appears to be an unframed canvas, a still life painting within the painting. This detail may offer a clue that the space is more than a drawing room. Might it perhaps also be an occasional artist's studio? Post-war repairs to Morisot's backyard studio likely forced her to paint inside her parents' house, and upon their move to a smaller apartment in 1873, she converted a bedroom there into a studio, working in similarly merged domestic and professional spaces for most of her subsequent career. A far cry, of course, from Manet's proper studios, fully separate and professionalized spaces. This is not to suggest that interior is some sort of self-portrait, but its protagonist's careful toilette and studied composure suggest that the visit she awaits might be one with bearing on her future. the kind of visit that Morisot, who turned 30 in January 1871 and feared she had lost her looks during the siege, might no longer expect in the post-war period. Is the still life painting tucked behind the young woman's chair meant to be her own handiwork? Is she contemplating a choice between marriage on the one hand and art on the other? While the subject of Morisot's interior sat in wait, the artist herself had begun sitting again for Manet, who painted a series of smaller, more informal portraits in the years immediately following the war. The project was her idea, as she explained to Édouard in August 1871. Once again, Manet finds me not too ugly and would like to have me back as a model. In the end, out of boredom, I suggested it to him myself. What followed was a long and fruitful collaboration, resulting in at least 8 canvases, usually dated to the period between the artist's return to Paris in August 1871 and Morisot's marriage to Eugène in late 1874. Signed and dated 1872, Berthe Morisot with a bouquet of violets was probably among the first. The likeness is transfixing, its author's delight in his model's direct gaze, untidy hair, and singular presence felt in every stroke. Years later, Morisot's daughter, Julie, hung it in her bedroom, remarking in her diary, "One can scarcely believe it was made in 1 or 2 sittings at most. Mama used to tell me she posed for it during the day before a Thursday dinner at Granny's. That day, Uncle Édouard told Mama she ought to marry Papa and talked to her about it for a long while." Julie's story is of interest on multiple fronts. First, it confirms that this is a picture painted with breathless speed. Its bold interplay of black and white, light and shadow, worked out over the course of 1 or 2 sittings. The experience must have been exhilarating for Manet, who always aspired to spontaneity, but seldom truly achieved it. Second, Julie's account tells us this painting was made not in the artist's studio, but in the apartment he and Suzanne shared with Manet's mother, Eugénie. This detail links the picture's glimmering background to the ruffled curtains of Eugénie Manet's drawing room, rendered more explicitly in this likeness of Suzanne. Third and finally, Julie's story frames the portrait with a bouquet of violets in the context of her parents' future marriage, casting Manet in the role of matchmaker. Some observers may struggle to reconcile this aspect of the account with what the picture shows, the palpable excitement of the encounter, conjured with rapt and sensuous delight. The intensity of both Morisot's regard and Manet's here produces an effect uncannily reminiscent of self-portraiture, a merging of painter and subject never quite equaled in Manet's oeuvre. Though the violets in Morisot's corsage, symbolizing both love and modesty, might cut either way, one cannot help but wonder whether Eugène was in fact the primary topic of conversation, or thought, in Granny's drawing room that Thursday afternoon. Perhaps surprisingly, the painting was not a gift to its model, who received instead a dainty still life of violets, a fan, and a folded note, inscribed with a tantalizing dedication to Mademoiselle Berthe, ... the intervening text is illegible, E. Manet. It was his first picture to enter her collection. The associated portrait, whether by sale or by gift, went to Manet's friend and patron, Théodore. Manet did give another painted portrait to Morisot, however, similarly intense and amused. Here Morisot's toilette is no less distinctive. The dark, untidy crown of hair, the black ribbon at her throat, the lace dress of that same sombre hue, punctuated with a little nosegay. Pas coquette, mais toujours élégante, as her daughter would remember. She had a quite personal taste. Manet painted her in black lace and pink slippers. Of the famous pink slippers, which Morisot wore in defiance of contemporary fashion, and which appear in 2 other portraits from the series, we find no trace in the bust-length likeness, though they may once have figured in this canvas, which Manet cut down dramatically before giving it to Morisot in 1873. Winsome and intimate, it is a fragment. An unfinished painting found in Manet's studio at the time of his death may provide a sense of this work's original appearance. Depicting the dark-haired model, semi-recumbent on a sofa, this was the only painting apparently attributed to another artist in the register of works compiled by Manet's godson. There it figures as Woman Lying Down, attributed to the Duchess Colonna. Adèle d'Affry, Duchess of Castiglione Colonna, an artist and young widow, befriended Morisot in the mid-1860s. A member of Second Imperial High Society, she exhibited sculptures at the Salon under the pseudonym Marcello. In 1872, she moved into an apartment down the block from Manet's studio, and the following winter accompanied Morisot there, reporting in a letter to her mother, Yesterday I put myself in a hansom cab with Manet Morisot, and we went to see Manet, whom I watched paint that lovely, shadowy creature. Its original composition also links the fragmentary portrait to one of Manet's most dazzling pictures from the period, Lady with Fans, a monumental likeness of the eccentric writer, composer, and salonière Nina de Callias. Rendered in shimmering brushwork, her pseudo-Algerian costume and Japanese backdrop produce what Manet's contemporaries would have recognized as an exotic boudoir atmosphere. Indeed, the theme of a woman reclining on a sofa was in itself so intimate as to be reserved for the depiction of courtesans, mistresses, actresses, or artists' wives. Little wonder, then, that de Callias's estranged husband warned Manet never to exhibit or sell her portrait. Though both were artists, the free-spirited de Callias and the socially correct Morisot had little in common, and on the surface the two portraits in progress at the very same moment seem as different as their sitters. But of course Morisot's portrait, too, was once full length. Was Manet truly dissatisfied with his treatment of Morisot's lower extremities, or did he cut the canvas down in the interest of propriety before sending it home with her to her parents' house? Either way, Morisot plainly admired Lady with Fans, whose composition echoes through her own subsequent production, and which, as we shall see, would one day hang in her home. The two portraits generally considered last in the series are larger, half-lengths of matching format but distinct emotional registers. In the first, at left, turbulent to the point of expressionism, Morisot wears deep mourning for her father, who died in January 1874. In the second, more tightly painted, Morisot seems the soul of composure, plucking daintily at the folds of her fan in a gesture that calls attention to her engagement ring. Having courted for years, Morisot and Eugène Manet were engaged in the summer of 1874, though a rather startling note from Morisot's brother, Tiburce, on learning of the contemplated union, complicates matters. So if you love Eugène Manet, even a little bit, marry him heartily, squarely, and counting on the future. Not on him, since he'll never do anything, but on luck, on yourself, and with the knowledge that one never dies of hunger. In your place, I know very well what I should do. I'd marry no one and adopt the free manners of a widow. Tiburce's hesitations about Eugène, whose outlook and personality could scarcely have been more different from his own, were specific, but he also worried more generally that his sister might make a marriage of convenience to stave off financial necessity. Did Morisot confide to Manet Tiburce's teasing suggestion that she pass herself off as a widow to live an independent life? And is this the context in which her portrait with a veil, seemingly so charged with raw emotion, should actually be considered? Seen as pendants, the mourning and marriage pictures resonate strangely with the letter, offering a reminder that marriage, for Morisot, meant both the death of her old life and the birth of a new one. I'm doing Eve with Bichette, Morisot wrote to Édouard in August 1871. They're giving me lots of trouble and growing leaden with reworking, and then the arrangement looks like a Manet. I realize it and am annoyed by it. The picture giving her such pains was woman and child on a balcony, marked by light drying crackle and scrape marks, evidence of revision. The irritating point of comparison would have been Manet's balcony, but by reversing our gaze, planting her easel behind the figures and looking out from the balcony, she made from this shared subject something new. Her picture marks the start of a conversation between the two artists, in which we observe them hand a compositional idea back and forth, transforming it, and in the process, their artistic relationship. Each composition in the sequence features a pair of figures, a young woman in dark clothing beside a little girl who turns her back to the beholder, grasping a railing and gazing into the distance. The idea evidently began with Morisot in August 1871, was taken up and modified by Manet in 1872-73, and received its final treatment from Morisot in the summer of 1874. Capturing a familiar Parisian vista from the terrace of her parents' home, Morisot portrayed her eldest sister, Eve, with her 4-year-old daughter, turning away to take in the view. Posed by the 4-year-old Paul-Marie Gobillard, known in the family as Bichette, this child resembles those found in Morisot's view of Paris and interior, not because the same girl must have posed for all three, but because each child turns her back to the painter. Morisot may have borrowed this pose, a useful device for capturing squirmy young models, From contemporary fashion plates, which routinely presented little girls from behind, the better to display bows and bustles. More practically clad in placemocks, Morisot's children serve a richer purpose, functioning as beholders within the painting, stand-ins for the observer, or indeed for the painter herself, liminal figures between real and pictorial worlds. It was surely this mediating role that drew Manet to Morisot's motif, which he would have encountered during social visits to her parents' home in late 1871 or early 1872. The railway, already in progress by the following autumn, would be his answer and his masterpiece of the period. Manet replaced Morisot's modest vertical canvas with a large horizontal format, her wide vista with a railroad cutting, and her sister with a professional model, Victorine Meurent, his great muse of the 1860s, but here again is a little girl in lost profile, grasping an iron railing and gazing into the distance, a proxy within the painted world for those of us outside it. Like Morisot's, Manet's is a Parisian view painting of sorts, in this case a view of the new neighborhood around the Gare Saint-Lazare, a product of Napoleon III's ruthless urban renewal campaign. This neighborhood was also Manet's home. The fall of 1866, he and his wife and godson moved in with his widowed mother at 49 Rue de Saint-Pétersbourg, and in July 1872 he relocated his studio to number 4 in the same street. The new studio, a bright, airy space originally built for fencing lessons, ushered in a new era for Manet, resulting in pictures that appeared lighter, brighter, looser, freer. The railway was his first major work completed there, and its upper left-hand corner contains a depiction of the studio doorway, a tall carriage entrance, slotted in from a pencil sketch made sur le motif. The little girl is therefore, in some sense, staring fixedly at Manet through his studio window, even as her adult companion stares fixedly in the opposite direction, back at the painting's beholder. Signed and dated in 1873, The Railway was the only one of Manet's 3 paintings submissions not rejected by the jury in 1874. Morisot surely saw it both in progress, as she sat for her own portraits, and on view at the salon. Returning to the shared motif the following summer while vacationing at the seaside resort of Fécamp. Here the faithful Édouard appears once again, seated on a beach house veranda beside her young daughter, the toddler Jeanne grasping the wooden railing, turning her back, and looking out at the sea. Adopting Manet's horizontal arrangement, Morisot used it to paint a marine. Sailboats, a few licks of paint apiece, skim over pale green on moving water, while a bright toy boat, its string in little Jeanne's fist, rests on the floor beside her. Joining Morisot and Édouard at Fécamp were the Manets, and family lore held that Eugène and Morisot fell in love sketching boat builders in the port. By summer's end, they had come to an understanding, and their mutual friend, Edgar Degas, had painted this portrait of the newly engaged Eugène. Fittingly, Degas would become the first real owner of Morisot's In a Villa by the Sea, cherished both as a personal souvenir and as a memento of a momentous year in the history of art. For it was Degas who had invited Morisot to join the Impressionists the previous spring, luring her away from the salon over Manet's objections. Breathlessly painted, suggestive almost to the point of incoherence, Morisot's In a Villa by the Sea announces a newfound independence surely linked to her brave new exhibition strategy. Formed in December 1873, with charter members including Monet, Pissarro, Renoir, Sisley, and Degas, the Impressionists' joint stock company leased rooms in the Boulevard des Capucines at the studio of the photographer Nadar in March. There, a private exhibition of more than 200 works by 31 artists would open on April 15th. Manet had declined his colleagues' invitation to take part, preferring to wage his battle for progressive art at the public salon. Presented at the Palais de l'Industrie, where thousands of artworks appeared before hundreds of thousands of visitors. 1874 was a year of ruthless rejection and conservative retrenchment. Manet's rejected canvases were among 2,205 turned away. Morisot had suffered partial rejections in 1872 and 1873, showing a single pastel at each salon. But in 1874, all her pictures were turned away, as an early April letter from Puvis de Chavannes, then a member of the jury, attests. Simply put, it's civil war, an idiotic civil war, if ever there was one. I know you're aware of your fate. They want Manet's head and will take it however they can. Had her association with Manet cost Morisot a place at the Salon? And with that venue closed, how would she sell her work? Puvis warned his friend off the independent show taking form at Nadar's, fearing it would be labeled a salon des refusés, like those notoriously organized by the State Arts Administration in 1863 and 1873. Another letter, though, had arrived at the Morisot household. Ostensibly addressed to the painter's mother, it contained an invitation to Morisot. There are 20 to 25 of us, Degas wrote. We expect a few more members. I recommend the exhibition to your daughter because I shall be part of it. And finally, because the name and talent of Mademoiselle Berthe Morisot are too much our concern to pass her over. Morisot accepted, throwing in her lot with the Impressionists and leaving the salon behind forever. She would be the only woman to exhibit under her own name that first year. It was a decision that would change the course of her life and work and seal her place in history. Puvis-de however, was not the only one opposed. Morisot's former teacher, Joseph Guichard, wrote to her mother deploring his ex-pupil's participation and concluding Manet was right to stand in the way of her exhibition. At this fork in the road, Morisot's great friend and mentor had pointed one way, and she had gone the other. He must have accepted her decision, though. One of her exhibited paintings was Alone, number 106, Hide and Seek, the catalogue reads, belonging to Monsieur Manet. Though Manet's only public involvement was this loan, critics were quick to associate the independent exhibition with his name, treating the Impressionists as his disciples and his students. Morisot was certainly no exception. Mademoiselle Berthe Morisot is a young lady of fine natural gifts who is steeped in the influence of Monsieur Manet, one critic wrote, asserting, she can give us an admirable sketch of a young mother in a muslin dress playing with her little daughter in a garden. This may be compared with the page of a novel read at haphazard on a railway journey. The association of Morisot's hide and seek with train travel hints at the effect of instantaneity achieved by her deft, rapid brushwork. It also inevitably ties this painting to Manet's contemporaneous salon picture, with its railroad tracks and puff of steam. Morisot's reviews, though, were generally favorable. As another critic's rapturous description of this work, reading demonstrates, Mademoiselle Berthe Morisot leads us into fields damp with seaside dew. She confronts the Parisienne's charming artifice with the charms of nature. What happy instincts in the way this muslin shawl gathers its pink border beside a blue or green parasol. Falling into a now familiar pattern of treating Morisot's painterly achievements as instinctive, a natural function of her gender, the critic nevertheless acknowledged her innovation in depicting fashionable urbanity, the Parisienne's sophisticated toilette and reading matter, at an intersection with rural life. The open fields, a hay wagon clattering through the background. The critic's interest in the striped and polka-dotted shawl, though, is telling. Signaling its decorative interest, he misses its practical function, namely to protect the model's white dress from grass stains. For both reading and hide and seek, reveal devices Morisot used to keep her models comfortable and occupied. The game that distracts a fidgety child, parasols and hats to keep off the sun, a shawl spread on wet grass, the turning pages of a book. Markers of femininity, fashion, and taste, to be sure. These clues also remind us that Morisot's pictorial world is not one that exists purely to be painted by her and beheld by us. Life continues all around her as she works, and by extension all around us as we look, hence the need for increasingly rapid brushwork, catching perception on the wing. As Jules-Antoine Castagnary, perhaps the most insightful critic at the exhibition, wrote of Morisot's submissions, here the execution accords with the idea expressed. Both pictures, their ideas, their expression, were plainly on Manet's mind 4 months later, when he paid a visit to his friend Claude Monet at Argenteuil. A family in a garden, a young woman, her summer dress found across the grass, an unself-conscious child, bright touches evoking flowers and sunlit greenery. Painted in vivid colors with brief, bright strokes, the Monet family in their garden at Argenteuil is perhaps Manet's most successful essay at plein-air painting. It has generally, and rightfully, been understood in the context of Manet's friendship with Claude Monet, who appears as the gardener, stooping over his flower beds at left. For the canvas dates to the late summer of 1874, which Manet spent in Monet's company at Argenteuil, studying his younger colleagues' outdoor working methods. The composition is certainly not without precedent in Monet's oeuvre to date. But the stronger analogues are to be found in Morisot's. The visit unfolded within the broader context of Manet's friendship with Morisot, and it is in these works, just shown at the Impressionist exhibition, that we find more specific analogies. Women in white with children, a shawl, a fan, nature seen in bright, even sunlight, delicate staccato dots and dashes of paints. The Monet family portrait was not the only picture to emerge from Manet's time at Argenteuil. Alongside various river scenes, Monet in his studio boat, his wife and son on a sunny riverbank, Manet began this painting of a chic couple in the stern of a sailboat. There. Swirls form in the vessel's wake before the water congeals into a solid mass, a horizonless blue that recedes not into imaginary space, but up and across the actual canvas. Manet borrowed this approach, like the abrupt truncation of the boat, from Japanese prints. The resulting effect is oceanic, but the peculiar thickness of the water conveys none of the movement and sparkle that he captured with broken brushstrokes borrowed from Monet and other river scenes at Argenteuil. For boating had a longer gestation than those works. He did not present it as a gift to his host or show it at the 1875 Salon, nor did he abandon it unfinished, though, instead retaining it in his studio, where he displayed it to the public in 1876, before submitting it to the Salon in 1879. Unusually for a Salon picture of this period, Manet did not inscribe a date beside his signature on boating, leaving one to wonder how extended and extensive his later interventions may have been. X-ray examination, and indeed pentiments visible to the naked eye, reveal that Manet changed the position of the sail and rope. More intriguingly, evidence of scraping and reworking in the foreground opens up the possibility that the female figure, as she appears today, belongs to a substantially later campaign, perhaps undertaken as Manet updated his canvas for display. For events moved quickly in the 1870s as the Impressionist group gained traction and coherence, and Manet sought to position himself as its leader. So different from the density of facture and solidity of form in the painting's male protagonist, Manet's open, fluttery handling of the young woman's striped dress and transparent veil suggests lessons learned from his Impressionist colleagues. Morisot, of course, continued to pay close attention to her brother-in-law's production and his Salon submissions, embarking on this canvas the summer after boating appeared at the Salon. Here, again, we find an abruptly cropped boat, a central figure who returns our gaze, and a companion who appears in profile. Morisot's compositional ingredients are the same as Manet's, but the effect of her picture, all glimmering reflections and wet zigzags of paint, is utterly distinct. In place of Manet's blue wall of water, Morisot provides a receding vista of park and lake, sunlight dancing and ducks paddling across its surface. This picture appeared in the 5th Impressionist exhibition, which opened on April 1st, 1880. Morisot there revealed a new body of work sharply distinguished from her previous outings with the group. Gone was the precise filigreed quality that had characterized her prior handling of paint, replaced by broad open strokes, pale ribbons of color that dissolve form into touch, leaving the edges and corners of many canvases almost bare. Critics were enraptured. Her paintings were described as ravishing, exquisite, and yet stubbornly unfinished. Praise for one specific picture, woman at her toilette, is emblematic of the larger trend. Paul Mantz, for example, rhapsodized over this picture's gray tones with pale pink touches picked out here and there, remarking, "One lingers before these beginnings of pictures, wistful and enchanted." Morisot's literal subject here is no great mystery, of course. Seated before a cheval glass, a model turns her back to the painter, pinning or unpinning her hair. A side table offers up a still life of glassware, a powder puff, and a white flower destined for or just removed from the protagonist's hair or décolletage. The mirror at left offers no image of her face or body, evading a conventional erotic trope inherited from old master depictions of the toilette of Venus. Is she dressing or undressing? The sense of vagueness, wistfulness, and enchanted indeterminacy invoked by Mantz and others has less to do with this familiar subject than with Morisot's way of painting it. The strokes of white and gray, pink and blue, that both describe and obscure the scene portrayed. 1 week after Morisot unveiled her canvas, a curiously similar one appeared just 15 minutes walk away at a small commercial gallery in the Passage des Princes. This space was operated by Manet's friend Émile Bergerac, editor of the fashion magazine La Vie Moderne, who had offered the painter a monographic exhibition in February. Manet seems to have accepted this invitation only around April 1st, that is, the very same moment when the Impressionist exhibition opened, and with just 1 week to mount his show. His hastily organized display of 25 pictures opened on April 8th. Was it the sight of Morisot's toilette scene in the Rue des Pyramides that had inspired him to show his own in the Passage des Princes? And what do we make of these paintings' striking similarities, not simply of motif, but also and especially of handling? Half-dressed before a mirror, Manet's model turns her back and tightens, or loosens, her corset, bearing a snowy expanse of shoulder and nape as she contemplates her own just discernible reflection. Brisk strokes of white conjure the pleats of her petticoat and laces of her corset, but the same kind of mark-making repeats throughout the background. In the cascade of drapery at right, the patterned wallpaper, the surface of the mirror, its bright, beveled edge. Like Morisot's, Manet's all-over handling here creates an effect at once sensuous and peculiarly chaste, marking an abrupt departure from his previous exploration of the toilette theme. A brassy, highly finished depiction of a woman in her underthings before a mirror. Here the protagonist, modeled by the actress Henriette Auxerre, is frankly a courtesan, applying makeup in a lavish boudoir as the top-hatted patron looks on. Manet completed the picture in 1877 and submitted it to the jury that spring, showing it in the window of a luxury goods shop after its inevitable rejection. He gave it the title Nana in an apparent nod to Émile Zola's courtesan character. And before the mirror has most often been understood as a study for Nana. But contemporary correspondence suggests that the sketchier canvas actually post-dates the more finished one by some months. Understood not as a study, but as a discrete formal experiment, it stands in more complicated relation to Morisot's work shown in 1880. Her exploration of the modern toilette seems to have begun earlier than Manet's and proved more enduring. Both may have recognized in the contrivance of a woman's appearance, and indeed the literal painting of her face, an allegory for the painter's art. But while the material realities of the toilette ritual, the application of face powder, the lacing of a corset, were a source of erotic fascination and mystery for Manet, they were for Morisot a matter of ordinary experience, as toilette scenes she showed in the second and third Impressionist exhibitions demonstrate. These, though, retain the whiskery facture and more literal precision of her earlier work. A paucity of exhibitions and sales between the spring of 1877 and the spring of 1880 makes Morisot's stylistic development difficult to track in these years. No Impressionist show took place in 1878, and the birth that November of her daughter, Julie Manet, necessitated a suspension of Morisot's practice through the spring of 1879. Returning to her easel in the brief snatches available to a new parent, Morisot may have made necessity the mother of invention, using her suddenly more limited time to paint to drive a transformation in her style. According to this timeline, Morisot's Woman and Her Toilette must date from between the summer of 1879 and the spring of 1880, that is, several years after Manet's Before the Mirror. Whether Morisot would have seen Manet's picture before embarking on her own is another matter, though. By 1879, her visits to his studio were no longer as routine as they had been in the days before her marriage. While he might have had ready access to her studio, a converted bedroom at the apartment she shared with Eugène, his home and studio were at separate addresses, so calling on his family would not have brought her into contact with his most recent work. It is therefore quite possible that Morisot never saw Manet's picture before it went on view in the spring of 1880, and quite possible that the two artists arrived at such similar destinations by wholly separate routes. But if neither picture inspired the other, Morisot's decision to exhibit hers as a finished work surely influenced Manet's decision to show his own on the same terms. For was this not the truly radical act? Critics might lament that Morisot lacked the courage to finish her pictures, but wasn't it precisely courage that was required to see, to understand, to show pictures painted at this breathless pace as works of art complete in themselves? Manet plainly understood immediately, writing to congratulate her on her smash success one Saturday in early April 1880. He concluded his brief note with a bit of good news. Efroussi has bought The Woman in Brown, referring to the discerning critic and collector Charles Ephrussi, also a client of Manet's at the time. The picture that had won Ephrussy's heart and opened his wallet was Winter, which presents its stylish model in cold weather attire before an abstract, touched all over background evocative of bare branches in the snow. 4 elegant Parisiennes correspond to the 4 seasons of the year. A pert brunette before spring blooming rhododendrons, a pensive blonde before a rose bush heavy with summer blossom, a majestic redhead before a textile adorned with fall chrysanthemums, a wintry figure bundled up against the cold. All 4 are painted at half length, on canvases of strikingly similar dimensions. 2 are Morisot's, 2 are Manet's, and neither artist painted any further seasons. The series that they form, however piecemeal and contingent, has much to tell us about these painters, their mutual influence and admiration near the end of Manet's life. The notion of seasonal allegory was itself, of course, nothing new, traceable through Rococo decorative cycles to Renaissance prints and back to antiquity. The subject had lately been revived by a mutual friend of Manet and Morisot, Alfred Stevens, who reimagined the seasons as contemporary Parisiennes, but treated them essentially as fashion plates. The choice to portray the seasons as more ordinary women, at half length, was quite original and Morisot's own. At the 1880 exhibition, she showed this pair as pendants under the titles Summer and Winter, whether in homage to the 18th century artists she admired, or indeed as a simple marketing ploy to make of 2 disparate and boldly experimental works something pleasingly coherent and art historically sanctioned. Manet took notice, and before a year had passed, embarked on his own seasonal Parisienne, a half-length springtime subject, presenting its adolescent model, the aspiring actress Jeanne de Marcy, in strict profile before a backdrop of rhododendrons. Manet's painting appeared under the simple title Jeanne in 1882, at a salon he did not realize would be his last. There it hung beside his final masterpiece, the bar at the Folies Bergère, which, however, attracted far less admiration than the young actress in profile. Not a woman, as one critic famously enthused, but a bouquet, truly a perfume for the eyes. Though Manet's picture, unlike his sister-in-law's, did not bear a seasonal title upon its initial exhibition, it plainly depicted a model in the springtime of life and quickly came to be understood as a vernal allegory. Manet soon set to work on a second canvas of identical format, cut from the very same bolt of cloth, posing Marie Laurent, a retired actress, demi-mondaine beauty and close personal friend, in dark brown furs, her hands thrust into a muff before a Japanese embroidered textile. The earliest recorded use of autumn as a title for this work, as of spring for the salon picture, occurs in notes made by Manet's godson in 1883. Autumn, he wrote, portrait of Marie Laurent in a brown pelisse. Antonin Proust had commissioned the 4 seasons. He had already bought Jeanne, spring. No further trace survives of such a commission, if ever there was one. And at the retrospective exhibition of Manet's works mounted after his death at the École des Beaux-Arts, Morisot singled out his paired seasons among the many other works on view as particularly noteworthy. Marie Laurent and Jeanne, 2 pendants, autumn and spring. Jeanne, shown in a garden, was painted in the studio. Mary L, bareheaded, her hands in a muff. Given her own skill and commitment as a plein air painter, Morisot's emphasis on the studio fiction of Jeanne's outdoor setting is of note. More importantly, regardless of their models, Morisot recognized these works as pendants, and as representations of the 2 seasons she herself had not painted. Can she have failed to see in them a complement to her own pair, together forming a series, albeit one that existed only in the 2 painters' minds? Manet's contributions to the series reflected a larger ambition he harbored in the late 1870s, to become the painter of Third Republican women, that is, of modern woman as a social type. This ambition would drive much of his late production, focused on images of elegant Parisiennes in their various habitats. He had certainly not invented such themes, already closely associated with Morisot, among others, but whereas Morisot's portrayals of bourgeois ladies, debutantes, and matrons are animated by personal experience and close domestic contact, Manet's related depictions of socialites, actresses, and demi-mondaines are animated by erotic interest. Manet's pictorial world brims with gallant possibility, the animating force behind scenes captured in a painterly vocabulary otherwise indebted to Morisot, high-keyed colors, blue shadows, and loose open brushwork. This painting, shown at the Salon of 1880, an indoor-outdoor after-lunch scene, all sparkling glassware and rustling greenery, turns on the young man's question to his skeptical date. Employing many of the same elements, the greenery, the glassware, the after-lunch mise-en-scène, even the rhythmic vertical lines structuring the composition, Morisot would evoke an utterly different setting, not commercial, but domestic, crucially unfolding in a world without men. If Morisot's pictorial universe is essentially a world without men, there is one crucial exception. Her husband, Eugène Manet, blonde and bearded, bearing an unmistakable resemblance to his brother Édouard, whom Morisot, however, never painted. Seated awkwardly astride a chair, Eugène gazes out a window at the harbor in this picture, Morisot's first of her new husband, painted on their honeymoon in England. The raised sash admits a breeze, filling the scene with light and air, but Eugène, quickly tired of posing, as Morisot reported to her sister. I began something in the sitting room with Eugène, poor Eugène, who takes your place, but is a less obliging model. He was, however, no neophyte, having posed for several of his brother's pictures. On their marriage contract, both Morisot and Eugène were listed as sans profession, and though Morisot clearly harbored professional ambitions, the need for financial support had played an important role in her decision to marry. The question of Eugène's future loomed large over the first months and indeed years of their marriage. The possibility of moving to London, Grenoble, or as far away as Constantinople to seek Eugène's fortune hovered over the honeymoon, and may indeed have played some role in their selection of England as a destination. There, on the Isle of Wight, Morisot nursed a new kind of loneliness, confiding to Edma, Eugène is still more taciturn than I. A deep uncertainty runs through her correspondence about this new shared life, begun in what was, at that time, middle age, and without much hope of having children. The couple evidently struggled to conceive on their honeymoon, adding poignancy to the glimpse we receive here through the window of a girl with her nanny on the quay, back turned. Upon their return to France, Morisot and Eugène parted ways for the rest of the summer. She went to stay with her sister. He returned to Paris. I feel quite lonesome without you, he wrote, reporting on his visit to a Parisian dealer, for he had begun to act as her agent. Remarking of her recent landscapes, I should bring Édouard over to see them too. Tender, respectful, Eugène's words laid out a path forward for a marriage still finding its footing. On matters of art, his own approval would never matter next to his brother's, but this was no cause for rancor. Manet might be Morisot's ideal artist, but Eugène would be her ideal husband. He had seen firsthand the support that great art-making demanded, all the practical details that needed tending to, the negotiations that needed navigating. Having been Manet's brother had taught him to be Morisot's husband, and their partnership would be one of the great love stories in modern art. Upon his death, Morisot hung the honeymoon portrait in her bedroom. The birth of Morisot and Eugène's daughter in November 1878 changed her life and work, as we have already seen. Like her marriage, the birth of Bibi, as Julie was called within the family, at once brought Morisot closer to her brother-in-law and separated them further. Even in the first weeks of Julie's life, Manet was evidently in Morisot's thoughts, however. Writing to her sister Eve, she expressed a certain ambivalence. Well, I suppose I'm like everyone else. I'm sorry Bibi isn't a boy. First of all, she has the face for it, and then she would carry on an illustrious name. It was, of course, not Morisot's husband, but his brother, who had given the Morisot name its luster. Eugène, however, would distinguish himself as a father. Parenthood seems to have expanded his patience, including as a model, as this double portrait painted in the summer of 1881 attests. Here is an image of paternal devotion virtually unique in the 19th century. At left sits Eugène, balancing a toy model town on his knees. Julie appears as intense on her game as her father is on her. Bright paint evokes both sitters' fair coloring, as well as the garden behind them in riotous bloom. The following summer, both artists turned their attention to Julie. Morisot and her family returned to the house they had rented in the suburban town of Bougival, while Manet and his took a house close by, at Reuil, visiting back and forth. Making mud pies was a favorite game of Julie's that summer, and in her mother's likeness at left, she seems absorbed in the act, carefully scooping sand or gravel into a small red bucket, heedless of her frilly white dress. Manet's picture shows less interest in the game itself, instead arranging his young model prettily on the watering can. Much to Morisot's regret, he did not finish the portrait, perhaps leaving it behind with the child's parents that summer. For finishing pictures had become difficult for Manet, whose first symptoms of late-stage syphilis seemed to have emerged in 1878, and by 1882 was suffering from severe pain and progressive paralysis in his left leg. He would not live to see another summer. Morisot witnessed his final agony in the spring of 1883. She experienced his death on April 30th as the death of a part of herself, writing to Édouard. These last days have been punishing. His suffering was horrendous, death in one of the most frightful forms I've ever witnessed firsthand. Add to these nearly physical emotions the long-standing friendship that bound me to Édouard, a whole past, our youth, our work, all collapsing, and you will understand that I am broken. I shall never forget the old days of friendship and intimacy with him, while I posed for him, and his charming wit kept me alert through those long hours. Since then, various things have happened, various strains crept in between us. It hurts me a bit. That's not quite the word. It saddens me and something more. What had happened between them? Whose influence had created this estrangement, if estrangement there was? The sadness of this letter bespeaks a loss that predated Manet's death. Indeed, in a strange way, his death would restore Morisot's intimacy with Manet by granting a degree of access to his work that she had not enjoyed since those hours together in his studio. After a triumphant retrospective at the École des Beaux-Arts, where the world first saw Manet's work all together in early 1884, Morisot was convinced that the sale of Manet's studio contents would be a similar success. Reporting to Édouard, the discerning public is amazed by the strength his work takes on when seen in its entirety. There is a certainty of execution, a masterful touch that impresses even the ignorant and stuns us all. But the art market, still staggering back from the French stock market crash of 1882, could not support the sudden influx. Total proceeds amounted to just over half the low estimate, and as major works began to sell for next to nothing, the surviving Manet brothers intervened, fronting 20,000 francs to acquire what they could. In all, Morisot and Eugène bought 12 pictures at the sale, giving some away as gifts, notably to Degas, Monet, and Pissarro, and hanging the rest in their new house. I have 3 big pieces, Morisot wrote to Édouard just after the sale. Laundry, Madame de Caliès, and a young girl in a garden. Then several smaller ones, a café concert singer, 2 pastels, a woman's torso, and some oysters. Did you see Madame de Caliès at the studio? A woman in black, reclining on a sofa with Japanese fans on a fabric background. It is a marvel that shall go to the Louvre. Joined by the Manets that already belonged to Morisot and Eugène, as well as further canvases inherited all too swiftly from Eugénie Manet and Gustave Manet, the pictures salvaged from the studio sale helped form both an intimate museum in the couple's home and a crucible for Morisot's subsequent production. A girl on the cusp of adulthood prepares for an evening out, putting the finishing touches on her hair before donning her dress. Morisot's powdery palette and fluttering brushwork suffuse the scene with freshness and nervous excitement, a sense memory, perhaps, of the painter's own teenage toilettes. Morisot returned to the toilette theme with renewed attention in the mid-1880s, drawing inspiration from a half-length nude she had acquired at Manet's studio sale. Unfinished and unsigned, this quintessential painter's painting surely interested Morisot in part because it laid bare her brother-in-law's methods, the dark, insistent contours, the draftsman-like brio generally lost in more finished works. The similarities here are, of course, plain enough. Each picture portrays a young woman at half length, arranging her hair, arms raised, a gold bracelet on one wrist. The bold contours of Morisot's figures suggest a particular attention to her brother-in-law's approach, though the modesty of her subject sets it apart from the frank sensuality of his. As a woman who had never received formal instruction in depicting the live nude, Morisot also seems to have used Manet's unfinished work to guide her exploration of this unfamiliar process, turning out a series of nudes immediately after acquiring his picture. The presence of Morisot's Manets in her own production was not always a matter of influence or imitation, though. His pictures also appear as totemic objects in Morisot's home studio. As early as 1877, Morisot had included Manet's fragmentary portrait of herself in a toilette scene, hanging half-effaced over a bureau in the right background. The same picture reappears in a later work painted in 1890. Looking back from the mirror, as if with the eyes of the painter herself, the portrait is reversed in reflection. Following Eugène's death in 1892, Morisot and her daughter moved into a smaller apartment where the painter produced further interior scenes, including a series showing Julie, a graceful teenager dressed in mourning for her father, practicing the violin. In one, Manet's portrait of Isabelle Lemonnier looks on, hands folded politely, as if listening to Julie's tune. In another, Morisot, painted by Manet, and her husband, painted by Degas, flank the drawing room hearth, as Julie plays between them. One Manet that did not belong to Morisot, but that likely hung for a time in her home, seems to have left a deep impression as well. This late self-portrait, dapper in a bowler hat, brush and palette in hand. It was inherited by the artist's widow, Suzanne, who moved in with Morisot and Eugène, occupying a flat with her mother-in-law in the couple's new home. There, Manet's portrait may well have inspired Morisot to paint her own likeness in 1885. Gazing out of the canvas, as if into a mirror, Manet and Morisot invite us to watch them paint themselves. Both portraits are freely brushed, Manet's evidently left unfinished, with daubs of white and yellow literalizing the paints on his palette. Morisot's is brighter and still more openly rendered, her palette hand a blur. Both subjects appear at midlife. Morisot's hair is dusted with white. Manet's rakish hat conceals a hairline in retreat. The flowers on her dress recall military decorations, and she was plainly proud of the picture, showing it in an exhibition of contemporary portraits in 1893. By the time of her death 2 years later, however, she had rolled it up and stashed it in a cupboard. What did it mean in the end for an artist still best known for appearing in another's work, the femme fatale of Manet's balcony, the friendly Medusa in his portrait with a bouquet of violets, at last to paint herself? What caused Morisot to roll up her own portrait and stash it away is a mystery, but might have had to do with her acquisition of the latter work. She bought her own portrait with a bouquet of violets at the sale of Théodore Duret's collection in 1894 and died a year later. As the last Manet she acquired, the portrait forms a poetic bookend to the first, the still life with a bouquet of violets which Manet had given her more than 20 years before. As one observer has lately pointed out, Manet's likenesses of Morisot are paintings of intimacy, none more so than this little work, its private meaning still elusive as the lines between salutation and signature in the painted note. Thank you so much. I would be so delighted to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was fascinating. I can't wait to see this exhibition in person. Just a reminder to everyone, it opens October 11th. And while we wait, for those of you who'd like to ask questions, and I remind you to please put them in the Q&A, I just wanted to, I'm struck by how refreshing it is to see so many familiar pictures now in dialogue with each other. And I'm kind of surprised, and I know we said this when we spoke a few months ago, that no one has done this exhibition before. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering why. Is it because of logistic reasons of getting all of these pictures together, or does it have something to do with the two artists not being seen on equal footing? Can you just talk a little bit about your hypotheses for why?
Well, I'm sure it's a little bit of both. And I will say that, the luxury of a lecture as of a catalog is that you can include things that, alas, you were not able to get as loans. I will say that we have been unbelievably fortunate recipients of an outpouring of generosity from lenders. Extraordinary loans coming to us from the Musée d'Orsay, from the Musée Marmottan, from the National Gallery of Art, from the National Gallery in London, from the Met, and. It is a sort of jaw-dropping array of pictures that we will have on view in our galleries. But I think to your other point, I think there is some hesitation about, or has historically been some hesitation about the wisdom of juxtaposing works by these two artists. when I first began discussing the project with senior colleagues in the field, a couple of them said, oh gosh, you'll have to be so careful about the Manets you choose so that you don't blow her out of the water. Which felt telling, you know. But, you know, I think that often when people think of Manet, they think of his early work, you know, the sort of transgressive works from the early 1860s. And those, of course, have much less to say to Morisot's work. She attended those salons, she was familiar with those paintings, but their dialogue really, I think, takes off around the time that she poses for the balcony. That's where it gets interesting. And it's only when you begin to take Manet's late work more seriously that you actually start to understand how much he learned from her in those final years. The exhibition that I co-organized with Scott Allen and Gloria Groom at the Getty and the Art Institute of Chicago in 2019 really was the first exhibition to focus on Manet's late career exclusively. This is a period that had long been written off as decorative, commercial, and therefore feminine. And I think only once you start to consider those works more seriously and try to understand what Manet is trying to achieve in all those, you know, portraits of beautiful Parisiennes, those flower paintings, and so on. It's only then that you start to really understand what he's picking up from Morisot.
Right. Actually, we have a question that relates somewhat to this. This is someone has written anonymously. Can you comment about Manet's sketchy portrait of Morisot that is in the Cleveland Museum? One person said it might have been a demonstration that Manet did to show Morisot what she should do.
I mean, that's a very interesting hypothesis. It's a really interesting picture. And the way that it shows up in the posthumous inventory of his studio contents is also a little confusing. There are two portraits. There's this other one with a purple hat that's usually considered a portrait of Berthe Morisot by Manet. That seem to be confounded with each other in the inventory. But really, the inventory is the first place that we have any sign of either of those pictures. We don't have, you know, accounts of them in letters, or so there's a lot of kind of mystery that swirls around them. I would encourage that attendee to read Isolde Pludermacher's fabulous essay on the portraits of Morisot in our catalog, where that wonderful sort of sketchy, revealing painting from Cleveland is discussed at greater depth.
Another question, will the exhibition travel?
Yes, crucially, and apropos of the Cleveland picture, it will appear at the Cleveland Museum of Art in the spring of 2026, presented by Heather Lamonides Brown, my fantastic colleague and collaborator there. So, you know, the checklist at the two venues will be a little different from each other. I think, you know, for those who are able to attend both, we would love to see you at both venues.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I know we've gone over time, but this has been so fantastic. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with us and giving us this amazing preview before the exhibition opens in a few weeks. Thank you all for joining us. And we will have this recording available in the coming weeks for reviewing for those who missed it. Thank you so much again, Emily. And what a delight. Can't wait to see the show.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thanks all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.